Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining. We'll give people a couple minutes to trickle in. I hope you have a nice warm beverage to go along with the talk tonight, or that you've printed out the coloring page to go with it. Thanks for joining us on the Zoom webinar. If you have any questions, you can type them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the very end. We'll give people a couple more minutes to trickle on in and to get our Facebook Live up and running. Hope you all have stayed dry today. I know that rain was pretty intense. And then the hail we had earlier this week. Thought we had that sunny day on, what was it, Monday? I actually got some yard work done, and then the next day was hail and then rain. Welcome to Washington. So hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Clarissa. I'm the Program and Volunteer Coordinator for the Puget Sound Estuarium, and welcome to our last Discovery Speaker Series of the season. We host these October through March, and so this will be our last one of this season, but it will start back up in October of this year. It will be on that the first Thursday of the month, from 6:30 to 7:30. And we host these Discovery Speaker Series so that we can invite artists, scientists, educators, and earth advocates to share about their current work or projects that they're working on to help spark conversation. So please feel free to type in your questions into that Q&A on the Zoom, and type in your questions down below on the Facebook Live so that we can get those answered and start those conversations. And then if you need something to keep you busy and listening, we do have these wonderful coloring pages. This one was drawn by one of our volunteers. Feel free to print them out and color along. Today, I'm going to try pastels, or oil pastels, which is one of my last art supplies. I've tried a different one every time, and this is the last one I can think of. So I'm glad this is the end of this series. I can start over for the next one. And then if you happen to have to leave at some point, or know someone who would be really interested in listening to this talk, it will be up on Facebook and up on YouTube after this. So then you can share it with those who may be interested, or watch the end if you have to leave early. But today I am so excited to welcome Heidi. She has been working in the field of noxious weeds for many years, starting with Mason County's noxious weed control, going on into Thurston County's noxious weeds and lake management division. And so today she's going to talk about the noxious weeds in our estuaries, how to identify them, and how we can help prevent them from getting into our estuaries and causing problems. And so thank you so much, Heidi, for joining us today, and feel free to get started.
Okay, thank you, Clarissa. So as Clarissa said, I'm Heidi Steinbach. I'm one of the noxious weed specialists with Thurston County. I work out of Public Works. And we're going to talk about noxious weeds in estuaries and wetlands. Before I get started, I just want to say that the noxious weed list has a lot of plants included on it, and this is focused more for wetlands and estuaries. So it's not going to be an all-inclusive list of species you might find on your property. And many of the noxious weeds can grow in a variety of sites. So while some might be more common in a terrestrial or upland setting, it doesn't mean that they couldn't be found in your estuary or wetland. Okay, there we go. So before we get into learning how to control and identify these species, I want to go over what a noxious weed is. All the noxious weeds are non-native plants that are invasive. They're going to pose some sort of threat to our agriculture, our economy, natural resources. Some of them are toxic and will pose a great risk to health and human safety. And then also they can cause problems with our infrastructure and structures in our properties. Many of these plants were introduced intentionally, some were introduced accidentally, but when they find their way into natural areas, they will quickly spread, decrease forage and habitat for native animals, and wreak havoc on our natural ecosystems. These two photos are Class A weeds that are found in our area. Garlic mustard, you can see, is spreading in that understory. This is one that causes huge ecological impacts if it gets in an area. And then giant hogweed. This is one that we've almost eradicated in the county, actually, but I put this up here because it poses a great risk to health and human safety. It's toxic as well as produces a toxic sap. And if you're exposed to it, you can get severe burns and blisters. So those are two good examples of some of the impacts of the weeds. And Washington State has noxious weed laws. The two main laws are RCW 1710 and the WAC 16750. If you're interested, you can go online and read more specifics about the laws, but basically they outline all property owners' responsibility to control noxious weeds on their property. Unfortunately, plants don't respect property lines or political jurisdictions, and it would make our job a lot easier if they did stay in one place, but they don't. So that's why we have these laws to require control, because if you don't control your weeds, inevitably they will spread and become someone else's problem. Washington actually passed the first noxious weed laws in the country, and that was back in the late 1800s to fight the spread of Canada thistle. But they didn't get officially put into place until the 1960s. And today, all counties have a weed board in some capacity. There's three different classes of noxious weeds. You have Class A, B, and C weeds. The Class A weeds are ones that are either new to the state or have a very small distribution in our state. And eradication is required by law for all of the Class A weeds. This is one that we have in Blue Lake here in the county, variable leaf milfoil. It requires eradication by law and is currently only known in one location in the county. And then the Class B and C weeds. Class B weeds are weeds that have a varied distribution. So they may be very widespread in some parts of the state, but nearly absent in other parts of the state. The state government can choose to designate certain Class B weeds, and then the counties can choose to select other Class B weeds to require control for. Class C weeds are things like oxeye daisy, hairy cat's ear. They're very widespread in all parts of the state, and the county can choose to select certain Class C weeds. So these are three examples. Brazilian alodia is a Class B designate, so that's one that's been designated by the state for control. Bohemian knotweed is a select, so that's one that the county has chosen to require for control. And then the Class C select yellow flag iris, this is very widespread, and it's been selected for control on rights of way and also certain lakes in the county. For all the other Class B and C weeds, control is not required if they're not designated or selected. But because the control laws change county to county, it's always a good idea to check the weed list of the location you're in, because just because a plant doesn't have control required in our area doesn't mean that it won't require control in neighboring counties. Scotch broom is sort of the poster child for noxious weeds in our area. It's very widespread. We have it in all parts of the county. It's hard to drive, across town and not see Scotch broom. But interestingly, in the east side of the mountains, they have a lot less of it. So that's the Class B definition. It's very widespread on the west side, but then nearly absent on the east side. So There might be some east side counties that do require control. And then Queen Anne's lace, this is one that's very widespread. Wild carrot's another name. We're all probably familiar with this plant, and this is a class C weed. So it's found in all parts of the state. This is an example, or this is the map of our current known locations of noxious weeds. Currently, there are just under 4,000 sites of regulated noxious weeds in the county. And I put this up so that you can see that this is a widespread problem that impacts us all. Another thing to notice is that the more points are clustered around the urban areas and also transportation sectors. Development and human movement is one of the great ways that these weeds spread. So as you have more traffic, you're going to see an increased spread in these weeds. Our program is responsible for surveying for noxious weeds throughout the county. If we find it on a property, we will notify the landowner. We provide them with information on identification, the impacts of the noxious weeds, and tips for control. We're responsible for controlling all the noxious weeds on the county properties and rights of way. And then we have a few special projects. So we do knotweed control in the Deschutes River and yellow flag iris control. In the Chehalis and Black River, we do Brazilian Alodia removal. That's manually removed. And then we do treatment of parrot feather and purple loosestrife. As I mentioned earlier, the private property owner is responsible for the control of noxious weeds, but in certain instances, we do offer assistance. We offer assistance for knotweed because it's very tricky to manually remove. And then we also offer treatment for garlic mustard and lesser celandine. These are both plants that have not very many sites in the county. And so we're happy to help offer treatment to prevent those sites from spreading further. If you know anyone with knotweed and they want help with it, you should mention this to them and they can definitely reach out, and depending on the site conditions, we're happy to treat it for them. So how do these weeds spread? About 50% of the noxious weeds, it's estimated, were intentionally planted. And if you think about it, when we pick plants for our garden, we want things that are drought tolerant. We want things that are ground covereds. We want things that are self-seeding, have prolific blooms. And all of these traits in a plant can lend themselves to become very invasive if they get in the right site. Water hyacinth is a popular pond plant or ornamental plant. And you can see why. It has very attractive flowers. But if this plant gets into natural areas, it can reproduce quickly and really negatively impacts those spaces. The photo in the middle is from Texas. They're having huge problems with water hyacinth. And you can see there that it's completely filled in this irrigation ditch and will cause issues with drainage. If it was in a natural area, it would be outcompeting beneficial plants and reducing habitat and food available to the wildlife in the area. And this picture on the other side of the screen, I put this up to show what, a pond garden might look like. You can see fragrant water lily in there. It looks like maybe an alodia is in there. We pick plants that are beautiful like this, but then when they get into natural areas, they can cause huge impacts. Fragrant water lily was planted at one point in our area, but now it's in many of our lakes and is really causing issues where it's able to spread. Weeds also move around by hitchhiking on equipment and people. With terrestrial weeds, we more think of seeds getting trapped in boots or on animals and equipment and then spread to a new area. And we recommend that people will boot brush, clean their equipment and animals before taking them to a new site. With aquatic weeds, it's a little bit different. You can see that plants will easily get trapped in boat motors or on a trailer. And other things as well, like zebra mussels can get stuck on boats and transported, but we're going to focus mostly on the weeds. But it's very important that you clean your equipment between moving from site to site. This will decrease the potential for weeds to spread. And Department of Fish and Wildlife is starting to put up some of these boat cleaning stations, and they have this campaign, Clean, Drain, Dry, that lays out the steps that you want to take for properly cleaning your equipment. So if you were to move your boat out of a lake and you notice that it's covered with plants, or even if you don't notice, you should clean it. And you could use a pressure washer, a hose. They show here that there's some brushes or scrubs to scrub off the surfaces of the equipment. And then you want to drain all the water out before moving it to a new site, because that can hold invasives as well. Improper disposal is another way that weeds spread. If you're controlling noxious weeds in your yard, you don't want to put them in the compost. You don't want to dispose of them in the yard waste or natural areas. Many of these plants can go to seed even after they're pulled, or can reroot easily. So that's a good way to start new infestations. And then if you have aquariums, you can't dump these into natural areas, because fish and aquatic plants can spread and become invasive from that type of disposal. I put South American sponge plant up here. This is a plant that's found in one location in Washington, and it's a Class A, so it's one that requires control by law. It's thought that this infestation originally started from improper disposal of a pond plant. And you can see that this plant has filled in this area and is really altering the habitat and outcompeting the other native plants. If you're dealing with woody plants, like a shrub, the best practice would be to either pull it and let it dry on the site. You want to monitor it regularly to make sure that it's not rerooting. I like to suggest using pallets or a tarp to prevent the plant from hitting the ground and rerooting. If it's flowering, you want to cut off the flowers and bag those, because it's likely that they could still produce viable seed. With herbaceous plants, if they're not toxic, you can pull them and leave them to dry at a site. If they are toxic, it's always recommended that you bag them and put them in the landfill garbage, because they can remain toxic for several years. And if it's a plant that has the ability to reroot or bloom and go to seed, I would also recommend bagging those and putting them in the household garbage. And if you have flowering herbaceous plants that you're dealing with, you can either pull those and bag them, or deadhead the plants, bag the flowers, and then pull and dispose the rest of the plant in the appropriate manner. Our department utilizes integrated pest management, and this is what we want most landowners to, or what we want all landowners to use when designing a control strategy for a site. This focuses on integrating different strategies: manual, mechanical, cultural habitat treatments, chemical treatment if necessary, and then biocontrols can also be an option. You want to focus on using the most environmentally friendly method first. So this usually involves manual control of a site, and then integrate other methods as needed. When you're designing a control strategy, you need to take into account a couple different things. Consider the site conditions, consider the species you're working with, what life cycle is it in, what use do you want for the site. Tansy ragwort, for example, if it was blooming, you would want to pull and bag the blooming plants. And if you had a large infestation, you might consider spraying for control of the rosettes, but not the flowering plants, and then always replant to add competition. These we put up just to show what the different control strategies might look like. So for manual mechanical control, manuals, hand pulling. Here is a picture of someone that's hand pulled Brazilian Alodia, and then they're going to take it off site to dry. And then if you have a site that requires larger equipment, you might need to bring in an excavator or a brush hog to clear out the plants. If the plant species or site requires herbicide might be necessary. And then biocontrols are also an option, but my note on biocontrols is that they're not going to work to eradicate a plant species. So if you're already actively working on a plant or a site, biocontrols probably aren't going to be the best option. You need enough of a plant population around for the biocontrols to be able to naturalize to be effective. So It's good in instances where you're not planning control strategies. For example, Scotch broom, St. John's wort, these are things that aren't regulated, that we're not actively controlling. So biocontrols would be a good option to reduce the spread of the plant and weaken existing infestations. For manual removal in and around water, there's a couple different strategies that you can use. Hand pulling or digging will work well if it's along a shoreline or an area where you can easily walk through the water. You can use a shovel or a tool to help dig out the plants. Weed raisers are a good option. For example, if you're controlling fragrant water lily in a lake, and I couldn't find a good image of the weed raiser, but you want to, throw it out underhand, let it cut the plants. And then you want to make sure you bring that plant material out of the water, because the decomposition of the plant material can add nutrients back in, and then it might escalate your weed problem. And then, and also if you're doing weed raising, you want to make sure to repeat this several times in a growing season, because the plants will quickly regrow and you need to repeat it in order to starve out the root system. You can rake weeds out of an aquatic setting. You can use just a normal garden rake, or I've seen where people have taken the metal head of the rake and then tied some strong line to it to throw it out and use that to rake in weeds. And that will kind of give you more room to work with. And if you're going to be doing any sort of manual removal of noxious weeds in an aquatic setting, you need to have this Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife Rules for Aquatic Plant Removal and Control pamphlet in your person. This can be found on their website, and you can download a PDF and print it out, or you could contact them and get a copy of it. And this outlines different control strategies and rules for removing noxious weeds. And as long as you're working with noxious weeds, this pamphlet covers you. If you want to be doing work on other invasives or on native plants, you might need further permitting to be covered by the work. And then also, after you've cleared out an area, always replant with natives. This is going to reduce the amount of bare ground that you have. That will discourage weeds from being reintroduced into the bare ground. And then also it's going to add competition, so you're less likely to have reinfestation. If anyone has issues finding this Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife pamphlet, feel free to reach out. My contact info is at the end of the PowerPoint, and I'm happy to send you the link. Here's just some pictures of what this might look like. You can see here that someone's just using a normal garden rake and they're raking out submerged weeds. And then they have a garbage bag behind them so that they can bag the plants and then dispose of them off-site. For something like bulrushes, invasive cattails, or purple loosestrife, digging can work well. So you can see here that this person is just using, the normal shovel, and they're digging out the weed, and then they're either going to bag that or take it somewhere where it can be disposed of properly. If your site is at a point where herbicide control is necessary, since this talk is focused on wetlands and estuaries, I'm not going to really get into too many specifics of how to safely apply. In Washington State, herbicide use in and around water is very closely restricted by Department of Ecology. And so if you have any applications that are done next to water, it needs to be performed by a licensed applicator with the proper aquatic endorsements. All products that can be used in an aquatic setting are labeled for aquatic use, and most of these products are restricted in the state, so you need to have a license to even purchase them. And if you're doing this kind of work, you need to make sure that the person has applied for the correct permits. For example, our department uses the NPDES permit. Okay, so now we will get into the plant ID piece. The first one I'm starting off with is knotweed. This is very common in our county. It's a huge problem in riparian areas. There's 4 species of knotweed in our area: Bohemian, Japanese, Giant, and Himalayan. They all look fairly similar, so we're just gonna sort of, talk about them as a group. And their impacts as well are very similar in riparian areas and for homeowners. We have a lot of people that will describe this as an herbaceous bamboo. And if you're not familiar with the plant, I think that's a really good way to describe it. It does look pretty similar to bamboo, but more herbaceous. The height of knotweed will vary depending on the site and the species, but usually it will grow up to 12 feet tall. When it's in its full height, the stem can be branched and will sometimes be curved or arced over. The leaves vary species to species. We'll get some good photos of the leaves on the next slide, but they can be oval, spade, or heart-shaped, or more oblong in the Himalayan knotweed. They're alternate on the stem, they're green, and with age, they're going to be sort of leathery in texture. The flowers of knotweed come on in the late summer, and they're produced in a small cluster near the tops of the stem. You can see the flowers here in this photo are in bloom. And knotweed, its life cycle, it comes up really quick in the spring, and that gives it a chance to outcompete our native plants and alter the habitat. It has a chance to really take hold, but then in the fall and winter, it dies back, leaving bare ground and just woody hollow canes. If you are a landowner that lives adjacent to a river or stream and you have knotweed on your property, in the fall and winter when it dies back and leaves that bare ground, if you have a major storm event or a heavy flow of the river that year, it can add to issues like erosion. Here are the 4 different species of knotweed. Bohemian is a hybrid of the Japanese and giant. It has sort of a spade-shaped leaf. This is the most common species of knotweed that we have in the county. Japanese has a smaller leaf and it's more spade-shaped. And then giant has a very large leaf. It's sort of heart-shaped. And then Himalayan knotweed. This is probably the least common species of knotweed we have in our area. I think it's only at 2 sites right now, and it has a more narrow and pointed leaf. Just some more photos of knotweed. So it's pretty amazing the materials that knotweed can come up through. You can see here it's coming up through this parking lot. Knotweed has the ability to come up through asphalt, concrete. We've gotten reports of it growing up through basements. If you have a drain field on your property and a knotweed infestation gets into it, it can grow through that drain field and really impact the functionality of it. Here's the flowers. So you can see that they're quite dainty, small, white, and produced in clusters. And then the close-up of the leaves. This is Bohemian knotweed, and they're alternate green. And this would be later in the season, so they'd get that tougher, leathery texture to them. Knotweed can reproduce in a variety of ways. So it can regrow from rhizomes. If you move soil and it has a small amount of the rhizome in it, this can resprout and create a new infestation. It can also reroot and spread from tiny little stem fragments. So if you mow knotweed or cut knotweed and then you put that in a new area to dispose of it, it can reroot and then that can start a new site. Landowners that try to mow knotweed for control end up spreading it through their property and the site just gets much bigger. And what we see too when we're doing our work in the Deschutes is that beavers seem to like to cut and move it around. So you'll notice little cut stems that have floated down and then they're starting to reroot where they land. And this has the potential to start a whole new infestation. And then they also produce seeds after they're finished flowering. Just some more pictures of knotweed coming up through concrete. It's quite a powerful plant. This is what it looks like early on in the season when it's first starting to emerge. It has this sort of reddish pink color to the leaves, and that fades with time. Mowing or cutting of knotweed can encourage root production. You can see here that it's pushed out horizontal roots or rhizomes that have creeped underneath this sidewalk and are now coming up over the edge. Okay, so yellow flag iris. This is a Class C select, very common in the county. Control is not required on private properties, but it is selected for control on rights of way. So on the road edges, it needs to be treated. And then also in certain lakes of the county, it's been selected for control. It's a perennial, so its life cycle lasts many years. The flower is very distinct. It has that iris-shaped flower that most of us are probably familiar with. And it's a very bright yellow. It can range from light to dark yellow, but it's usually this very bright yellow. The plant grows from about 2 to 3 feet tall. This is the only full-size 3-foot tall yellow flowering iris we have in our area. We do have the shorter yellow flowering irises that I believe are Siberian irises, but if you have an iris in your yard that's 3 feet tall and has a bright yellow flower, it's most likely yellow flag iris. The leaves are long and flat, resemble or sort of sword shaped. They look very similar to our native cattails when not in bloom. And this plant has the ability to spread by rhizomes and seed production. The seed pods you can see here, they have the ability to float quite a ways in water. So when they go to seed and drop off the plant, those can float to a new shore and start a whole new infestation. This plant is toxic to humans and livestock, as well as produces a toxic sap. So if you're working with the plant, make sure you wear gloves, long sleeves, keep yourself protected, and always clean equipment after working with the plant, because the sap can transfer onto other materials and you could be exposed that way. Just some pictures of yellow flag iris. You can see here that it's spreading in this lake shore and is outcompeting our native plants, really altering the habitat for waterfowl and other things that might be in the area. And then in the other picture, you can see yellow flag iris when it's not in bloom. It has those skinny, short, sword-shaped leaves. Looks very, very similar to our native cattail. Hanging sedge. This was added to the noxious weed list last year. This is one that we are finding more and more of. It was popular as an ornamental plant, and you can see why. It has this beautiful evergreen foliage. The plant grows quite large, from about 2 to 5 feet tall. It can spread by rhizomes and seed production. It sort of forms these loose clumps, and when it's first coming up, it looks similar to a grass. These pictures were taken off the Evergreen Farm Trail. That was our first site that we had documented in Thurston County, and it was found to be spreading there in the wet areas of the trail. And we're starting to find it more and more next to the beach and in those wet, moist, shaded areas down sort of by the forest. The leaves are green, but if you look at the base of them, they'll have a purple to red color, and they can be up to 50 inches long. The flowers are what gives hanging sedge its name. So you can see here that they're very long, they're pendulous. They start off green and then end in this sort of brown tawny color. When they're mature and they have their matured fruits in the flowers, they're a dark brown, and they can be up to 12 inches long. So that's how it got its name. It has these very long, hanging, pendulous flowers. You can see the base of the leaves here have this sort of brick red-brown color to them, and then just another full-size mature plant. Sedges and grasses are sort of hard to identify from each other. So a way to ID the sedge is if you feel the flowering stem, it's going to have 3 sides and feel triangular in shape. Purple loosestrife. This is a very invasive plant in wetlands. It will form huge monocultures where you'll just have purple loosestrife. So if you have a small site or just a few plants, really a priority that you get on it early. It has purple, showy flowers with 5 to 7 petals. They grow in these long spikes at the top of the plant. The leaves are opposite or can be whorled around the plant. They're narrow and 3 to 5 inches long. The stems and the leaves are covered in hairs. So if you feel the plant, it will feel quite fuzzy. The stem as well can be sort of angular when you feel it. So it can have 4 to 6 sides when you feel it in your fingers. And this plant can get quite large. It can grow from 3 to 10 feet tall and up to 5 feet wide. The height can vary just depending on the maturity of plant or the site conditions. More pictures of purple loosestrife, so you can see those really beautiful purple to dark pink flowers. And then this is a typical habitat where you'll see it on the edges of a river. And a site like this, where it's growing on the edge of a river or a stream, that would be a good candidate to manually control. But if it's in bloom, you want to make sure that you cut off those flowers first, bag the flowers, and then work to get the rest of the plant out of the ground. Garden loosestrife, another similar looking plant in its overall shape, but it's actually in a different genus. It's a Class B designate, so it's one that the state has designated for control. It has very showy yellow flowers with 5 petals, and you can see here that the center or throat of the flower is sort of orange in color. This was a popular plant in gardens as an ornamental, and you can see why it's very attractive, but when it gets into wetlands, it spreads quickly and alters the habitat. The entire plant is covered in soft hairs. It's sort of fuzzy. We'll get a good view of this later. And the flower or the leaves can be whorled or alternate on the stem. And the height of this varies, but it can be about 3 to 6 feet tall. Here's some more photos of the garden loosestrife. This photo, first photo, you can see it's starting to invade a lake shore. So this would be a site that would be easy to manually remove. If you can't get all of the plant out, you could use a shovel to remove the root or even a pick to get it out of the ground. They're in bloom again, so you'll need to bag those flowers. Here you can see those leaves. They're sort of whorled around the plant and kind of a fuzzy gray-green color. And then the flowers, very showy yellow at the tips of the stems. Common reed or Phragmites. This is one that we don't have too much of, but neighboring counties do have quite a bit. So it's good to keep an eye out for. We do have a native species of Phragmites that looks pretty similar, and these plants do have the ability to hybridize with each other. But this one is a non-native that requires control. It's a perennial grass, so it lives for many years and it gets quite tall. It can grow up to 12 feet tall, depending on the site. You can see in this picture, it's invading a railroad. Sorry, it's invading along the railroad. And that full-grown man is nice for the scale because you can see that it's quite a large grass. Grass identification is tricky because they do look so similar. So what I would look at is the flowers. The flowers are pretty unique on the Phragmites. They're quite showy for a grass. They appear silky or feathery, kind of resembling the plume of the pampas grass that you might have in the garden. They're light brown, but then can have this sort of purple tint, and they can be quite large, about 8 to 16 inches long. The leaves are lance-shaped like most grasses, and they're smooth, so they're not going to have any hairs. The stems are hollow and they get quite woody with age. Just another close-up of the flower. You can see it's that shiny, feathery brown color, quite attractive for a grass flower. And then some different infestations. So it doesn't only have the ability to be invasive in wetlands, but can also be invasive in more terrestrial sites. And the flowers persist on the plant for quite a while after they're finished blooming. So you can see here that they're this kind of light brown, dry color. Another thing to look at with Phragmites is that the leaves will often be pointed or turned one way, the direction that the wind's blowing. So it will sort of have this swept over look. And you can really see that in the first 2 photos with the flower and the infestation in the wetland. They're kind of pushed to one direction. Butterfly bush. This is one that we're probably all pretty familiar with. It's a very common plant here in Olympia. It's very popular in gardens. We have so much butterfly bush that control is not required. But I would look at your site, and it doesn't mean you have to hack down your butterfly bush, but if you notice it escaping cultivation and popping up in new areas, that might prompt you to start controlling it. If you live in a riparian area and you have a huge infestation of butterfly bush, it will outcompete your native plants. It will outcompete willows and will change the habitat and can also lead to more erosion in those areas. It has very showy purple flowers with 4 petals. Usually they're purple or white with an orange center, but there's many cultivated varieties that have different colored flowers. It's a deciduous shrub, so it will lose its leaves in the fall and winter. The leaves are opposite, kind of gray-green in color. And it grows quite tall. It's kind of a small tree, so it grows up to 15 feet tall. And the branches, they'll sort of arch over when it's at its full maturity. The good news about butterfly bush is if you want to plant this in your area, but you don't want it to spread, there are a lot of sterile cultivated varieties available, and these come in many different colors. So if you go to a nursery and are looking for butterfly bush, it's very likely that it is one of these sterile cultivated varieties. I put these pictures up so that we can see the impacts of butterfly bush. This is one of those plants when we talk to homeowners about it, people sort of think, well, what's the big deal? The butterflies love it. It's a beautiful flower. It's not escaping cultivation. And I can understand feeling that way, but it's good to see that when it gets into the wrong site, it really can spread quickly. Here you can see it on the edge of a river. That's a pretty typical habitat where it will be a problem. And everything here with these sort of dry brown flowers is butterfly bush. So you can see it's forming a monoculture and is really altering the plant communities there. Just some more pictures of butterfly bush and how it spreads. It's a big problem in gravel bars if it gets into those areas. I saw a site over on the east side of Olympia where it had invaded a vacant lot, and it was sort of gravel, well-drained soil. And the butterfly bush was starting to really spread and was actually competing with Scotch broom. So, it is going to be spreading more. We're going to see more of butterfly bush. And, we want to get on these weeds early before they become the next Scotch broom. Policeman's helmet. This is one that does not require control in the county either, but I like to put it up here because it is highly invasive in wetlands. It's a Class B weed. It has pretty distinct flowers. They're light to bright pink, and sometimes so light that they almost appear white. They grow at the tops of the stems, and the branches where the stems are, or the area where the stems are usually branched. This plant is very easy to manually remove. So if you have it at your site, you can pull it and bag it, or pull it, and if it's not in bloom, put it in an area where you can monitor it to make sure it breaks down. The leaves have serrated edges. They can be opposite, alternate, or whorled around the plant. They're green in color, but you can see that the vein that goes down the center of the leaves is sort of pink. The stems are smooth, so they're not going to have any hairs, and they're bright red to purple in color. The height can vary, but it can grow anywhere from 3 to 10 feet tall. Spotted jewelweed. So this is another impatiens that we have in our area. Policeman's helmet is also a species of impatiens. This is very common, especially in wetlands and riparian areas in the county. And when it is able to spread in an area, it forms really dense patches and restricts stream flow, reduces food availability. And it also has the ability to hybridize with our native jewel weeds. And so that can alter the genetic diversity of our native populations. It has distinct small orange flowers. They have a dark orange to red splotching at the bottom of the flowers. The leaves are opposite, alternate, or whorled. They're green, and they have a minutely serrated edge. So you have to look very close to see that serrated edge, but you can sort of see it in this far photo. And they only grow from about 1 to 5 inches long. The stems are going to be smooth, not have any hairs on them, and are going to be green, but can sometimes have this reddish tint to them. And the height of it is about 2 to 5 feet tall, so it's quite a bit shorter than the policeman's helmet. And both of these, I know I already said this, but they're very easy to manually remove. So if you have a small site, I would say get on it early, pull those, bag them before it's able to spread further. So now we're going to get into more submerged weeds. Parrot feather is one that we have on the Chehalis River, and we do control work each year to deal with these infestations. And the work has been very successful. We've made really good progress. And at this point, we really only have one major infestation, and the rest of it is just small patches that require monitoring and cleanup. This plant starts off submerged during the first half of the summer, so it grows underneath the water. And then in the later part of the summer, it will grow up and above the water, about 10 inches above the water, and forms these sort of mats. They look like mats around the water or edges of slow moving creeks or rivers. The emergent leaves are whorled around the stem, and they're finely dissected, bright green, hairless, very smooth. And to me, they almost look like they're artificial. They look so shiny when you're seeing it in person. The flowers are going to be born at the tops of the stems on that emergent portion, but they're very small and white, and you'd almost never notice them on the plant. Just some more pictures of parrot feather. So that's what we do in the Chehalis. We survey with kayaks, and we treat the infestations. Where you'll see it growing is usually the margins or edges of the river, or in slow moving portions where channels are coming down into the river. And then here you can see how invasive parrot feather can be at a site. So it's forming this large mat and is creating issues of movement or water flow, and is also going to outcompete our native plants. Brazilian Alodia, this is another one that we are controlling in the Chehalis River. This is a submerged plant, so it grows underneath the water. And the lowest leaves are opposite or whorled, and they're going to be in sets of 3. As you move up the stem, the leaves are going to be sort of serrated, but not too obviously. It's going to be a very minutely serrated edge, and they're in whorls of 4 to 8. The branches can be, or the stems can be either branched or unbranched. And this plant can really fill in waterways quickly. It can clog them. It can change the movement of the water. And if it's growing in areas around a swimming dock or where you have recreation, it can pose risk for swimmers and divers because you can actually get entangled in the plants. That's how thick these mats can grow. Here you can see an area that's really being devastated by Brazilian Alodia. The water quality is reduced, and if you were trying to swim or kayak through that area, it would be pretty tricky. Here's some manual removal of Brazilian Alodia. We take out tons from the Chehalis River every year, but this still needs to be completed. And currently it's being controlled by divers. So divers will go hand pull the plants. They either put them in sealed bags or in these bins. And then this is taken from the site, and it can be dried in an upland location. We have a native Alodia. It looks pretty similar, but it's much smaller. So you can see here's a good size comparison, and the leaves of the native Alodia grow around in sets of 3 versus the Brazilian Alodia. It's much larger, and it's sets of 4. Variable leaf milfoil. This was one of the first pictures we looked at on the Class A slide. So this is known in one location in Blue Lake in Thurston County, and it has a submerged portion and then also grows up and above the water. The submerged leaves are finely dissected, they're feathery, they're sort of whorled around the stem. And then the leaves that grow up and above the water are more oblong and about 2 to 6 inches long. You can see in this photo that the stems, especially of the above water portion, are more of a reddish brown color. And this plant has the ability to hybridize with our native milfoils. So this can alter and reduce the native biodiversity and change the genetics of our native milfoils. Also, if it's allowed to persist in an area, you can see underneath this bridge that it can easily clog waterways, and again, poses risk for swimmers that could get entangled in the plants. More photos of the variable leaf milfoil. So you can see the underwater portions. They're growing up and towards the surface of the water, and the leaves are very dissected, narrow, and whorled around the plant. And with that, I'll take questions. And again, this is not an all-inclusive list of the noxious weeds that you'll find in wetlands or in the county, but just something to get you started. And feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about plant ID. We're happy to look at pictures sent to us or complete site visits. Yeah, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Heidi. That was very informational. If you have any questions, type them into the Q&A on Zoom or type them into the comment section below on the Facebook Live. To get things started. Heidi, do you have a great success story that you cling to keep you going?
Yeah, you have to. I think one of our success stories would be garlic mustard. So I didn't show that plant, but if anyone wants more information, I'm happy to talk about it or send pictures. And then also the state weed board, they have a lot of good photos. So I would highly recommend looking at that link that you guys posted on the page. But garlic mustard. So my first year with Thurston County, we were doing poison hemlock surveys, and I'd never seen garlic mustard in the field. And I went to this site and saw this plant that looked like the photos I'd seen taking over, and it wasn't yet in bloom, but I remember, I snapped a photo of it, sent it to someone else, and they thought, maybe not, go back when it's in bloom. And so anyways, I went back to deal with the poison hemlock. Actually, it was a new landowner, and I look over and it's all in bloom, white, covering the hillside, and then I realized, wow, that is garlic mustard. We need to get on that. So, within a few weeks, we had permission to treat from both private property owners. The city controlled the portion on their right of way. We've been working to you have to bag all the flowering plants, and work really careful to not, spread seed to a new area. So we do boot brushing, clean everything. And then we did treat with herbicide, the rosettes, just because there was too much of it. And we have been working on that site now for about 2 years, and it has been so reduced. I'm really hopeful that we might actually be able to eradicate that one. And right now we just have the 3 sites. We haven't found it anywhere else. So I feel like that was really a good result of early detection, rapid response to a site, and just the cooperation from the private property owners and the city was really nice. We couldn't have done that if we didn't have cooperation from all parties. So that's one of the success stories that you got to cling on to.
That's really great that both property owners in the city was like, yes, deal with it. That
Yeah.
probably doesn't happen too often.
Oh, it just depends. Yeah,
Okay,
the cities are all pretty good. And people, they have their reasons for not wanting your help, and I try to be respectful of that, but it's always a lot easier when people are cooperative.
Then we have a question from someone. They joined late, so apologies if this was already covered, but always great to reiterate. For plants like knotweed, which we should replant with native plants. What native plants are the best choices for recovery after a big disturbance, like pulling out knotweed?
Okay, that's a good question. It really depends on the site. And so it's tricky to give planting recommendations without knowing what ecosystem you're in or what habitat it is. I always recommend that people kind of look around, see what's native that's doing well, plant what they're already seeing flourishing there. If you were to treat the knotweed, it might help to put something like a quick growing annual grass in that will help to cover up the area and it will take off quick. I've heard of people doing willow staking to shade out the area and slow the regrowth of the knotweed. The Washington Native Plant Society has a really good list of planting options and it's broken down by habitat. So I would recommend going there and looking at it. And if you Google Washington Native Plant Society habitat list, you'll get directed there. And I think it's on the right side of the screen. You'll see a by habitat link and you can click on that. And it has a lot of different options.
Yeah, they liked that plant native plants that you're already seeing, because if those are doing well, then they'll probably do well for the ones that aren't the invasive ones.
Yeah. Yeah, and always replant after treating. If you're going to go through the effort of controlling a weed or an invasive, leaving bare ground is just going to leave room for either the regrowth of the same plant or other invasives. So it's always good to replant and cover that bare ground.
And then do you have any recommendations for what to do to replace the butterfly bush?
Oh, like non-invasive alternatives. I'm trying to think. We have a book called Garden Wise, and that has an example of an invasive and then other native alternatives or non-invasive. And I think they recommend planting California lilac as one. If you wanted to do a flowering native plant, it's not going to get as large, but you could maybe try some of our native roses because those have sort of showy flowers. Rhododendrons are always nice. Yeah, but I think what the state recommends is a California lilac, and it kind of adds the same fragrance and floral characteristics to the garden.
Nice.
And if you want to reach out, we can always I can always email the link to the Garden Wise book, or we could mail you one, through the mail.
Someone said they thought they heard red flowering currant, maybe.
Oh, that's a good option. Yeah, red flowering currant is a great native plant.
Sweet. And then a clarification for the butterfly bush. I think you mentioned that it was sterile. Does that mean that it does not pollinate itself?
So not all butterfly bushes are sterile. I don't know how many years ago it was, but they started developing sterile cultivated varieties. And so they're not entirely sterile, but I think it's less than 80% of the seed is viable. And most butterfly bushes that you're going to find in a nursery now will be these sterile cultivated varieties. But if you live in a site where it was planted a long time ago, or if you're noticing it popping up on the roadside, that's going to be the old non-sterile variety. So they're definitely still out there because they were widely planted. But anything that you're purchasing recently is, I want to say, likely going to be the sterile cultivated variety. Yeah, but no, butterfly bush in its natural form is not sterile. It produces thousands of seeds.
Good to know.
Yeah.
If anyone has any more questions, type them into the chat or the Q&A on the Zoom or down below on the Facebook in the comment section. Otherwise, thank you all for joining us. I learned some new tips and tricks today, and Usually they say don't touch sea creatures unless you know how to identify them. And now I know not to touch yellow lilies because they could also be harmful.
Yeah, that was a lesson for me too. I definitely used to just hack into things and not really think about it. But there are a lot of things that either have toxic sap or poison hemlock and tansy, for example, even hand pulling or weed whacking and breathing it in, you could get sick. So if you don't know what you're dealing with, now I always will wear gloves and try to avoid skin contact. And this presentation didn't deal a lot with toxic plants, but many of the noxious weeds are. So in general, we always wear gloves, protect ourselves, and then wash our hands after eating or drinking. Or before eating and drinking. Yeah. So, and I'm happy to, if you have poison hemlock or any of the other noxious weeds, feel free to reach out to our program and we can provide control recommendations.
We got one last question in. Are cow parsnips and hogweed related?
That's a really great question. Yes, they are. So they're both in the carrot family. We get a lot of questions about this when cow parsnips in bloom. Giant hogweed and cow parsnip look very similar. They both have the large white umbrella shaped flower. They both have lobed leaves. They look very similar. Cow parsnip, usually when it's in bloom, it's going to be about 5 feet tall, I want to say. Giant, height can vary depending on site conditions, but it's usually about 5 feet tall. Giant hogweed is so big when it's in bloom. It's about 15 feet tall. It's towering over your head. And the umbel, the white flower on it, it can be up to 2 feet across. So they are related. And I believe cow parsnip also has the phototoxic sap. But cow parsnip is a native plant, so it doesn't require control.
Good to know. Wow, plants get big.
Yeah, they do. No, the giant hogweed is beautiful when it's in bloom. You can understand why people planted it, but it's horribly invasive and poses great risk to people. Yeah, but we have a lot of cow parsnip. We have a lot of cow parsnip in the county. You'll see it a lot on road edges, and it's beautiful when it's in bloom.
No, it's not the bad one.
No, dangerous, but not bad because it's native. Yeah.
Good to know. Thank you so much, Heidi, for sharing your knowledge with our community here at the estuarium. And thank you everyone for joining, those who joined on Zoom and those who joined via Facebook Live. Thank you so much for all of those great questions that you had so that we could get that conversation going, get those confusing similarities straightened out. And then if you filled out the coloring page,
oh, beautiful.
Make sure to send it to us or send a photo to us so that we can see all of your beautiful colorings that you've done while listening to our talks. We had the orcas and salmon. We talked about our maps. We solved the mystery of the salmon at the Hood Canal Bridge. We talked about the Stutchas people that lived here. And then we talked about birds with Alex. And now we got our noxious weeds. So I hope you all had a great time. If you missed any of those videos, they will be on our YouTube, so you can go back and look at them, watch them again, download the coloring pages that our volunteers made so that you can color along while listening to these great talks. And then again, this is our last one for this season, so please join us again in October when we start back up. You can follow us on social media when we'll post about it, or if you scroll to the bottom of our website, you can sign up for our newsletter, and that will give you monthly updates about what's happening at the estuarium. So then you'll be right on time in October to get the next one going. So thank you again for everyone for joining us. I hope we didn't keep you up too much longer. I know these evening activities can kind of be tiresome, but thanks for joining. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.